Welcome to the Libertarian Institute and Odyssey channel. I am with Connor Friedman, one of our great writers on foreign policy. Connor, what's happening, brother?
I'm doing great, Keith. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I want to start off with the long, lucrative, and bloody road to World War III.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
is this article about that you have for us?
Well, it's about a few things. I find sometimes when stuff like this is going on, I every like week or so will kind of parse through and keep track of all the escalations or the things that I think are most notable, and then kind of compile them, and then go, just add my sort of commentary on it. Well, there was a lot in since my last one, which was "We Want You to Keep the War Going," which was all about how it seems like, well, it doesn't seem. If you read the reports in the Washington Post, if you listen to what the Turkish foreign minister has said about other NATO member states, if you look at what quotes from the Estonian prime minister, and even like EU officials, you can hear that. And now, especially, that's what I'm getting into here with the media, the Blob, Blinken, Austin, the Pentagon, Milley. They're all talking about how this thing is going to go on for years and years and years, and how they're going to support Ukraine the entire time, and we got to do more to support Ukraine. So the money and the aid packages keep increasing, like the price of all of this. One of the things that got me going was the fact that now Biden's requesting a $33 billion aid package to cover Ukraine, which includes more than $20 billion in just in arms going to Ukraine. That's supposed to last us through the fiscal year, so through the end of September. But what's so ridiculous about it, of course, is we're looking. At this point, just in the last 2 months, there's a great piece I link in here from Responsible Statecraft where they talk about how the money that is going to Ukraine at this point is set to surpass the entire State Department budget, which I suppose is reasonable given that Blinken is virtually calling for regime change in Moscow at this point and hasn't talked to Lavrov in since February 15th, since before the actual war started. So one of the things I get in here is primarily about how the debate has been restricted. The whole conversation we're allowed to have. If you look at if you read mainstream press, they really kind of present this case to the American people that the more weapons we send to Ukraine, the better, and the heavier weapons and more artillery and attack helicopters, and if we can get them fighter planes, that would be great, and all this kind of thing. And people just kind of go along with this because they don't hear the alternative. And the truth is as we, create this groupthink and limit discussion, we get closer and closer to war, because now we have people like Adam Kinzinger saying that we should have this authorization to use military force. This reminds me of Elaine Luria, who has this bill. It's the same kind of lunacy, because there's a bill from Elaine Luria, who's a Democrat in Virginia. She's a House rep, and she put forward a bill called the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act. And well, I don't know if she put forward, but she's certainly a big booster of it. And she was like, the idea was like, I'm the Democrat, I support this idea the Republicans have. And basically what it is they want to make it so that they pre-authorize Biden or whoever the next president is to attack China and go to war with China if they use force against Taiwan, and bypassing the Constitution and all this. So with this AUMF, he's authorizing Biden, Adam Kinzinger, this very hawkish Republican congressman from Illinois. And he's talking about, who's a big proponent of us instituting no-fly zones and all of this. He's saying we should go to war with Russia if they use in Ukraine biological weapons, chemical weapons, or nuclear weapons. And the problem is, of course, as I show here, is that our policy makes nuclear war much, much more likely. And we're constantly, Lavrov is constantly warning about this. He recently compared the current situation to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And whenever they talk about nuclear war, these high Russian officials, you eventually hear the Pentagon, there'll like be like an article that comes out where senior Pentagon officials are going, "Oh, well, we're not too concerned about it. We look at their capability every day, and it doesn't seem like a big deal to us. We don't see a threat to us. We don't see a threat to NATO." And so, and as the part you're highlighting, I think that this sort of red line, as he calls it, harkens back to what was going on in Syria. And I think that basically it's an incentive to violent militant groups. And back in the day in Syria, this was Al Qaeda and their Turkish allies. And nowadays, you'd be looking at the Nazis in Ukraine, or anybody really who's trying to precipitate direct U.S. intervention. And a guy like Kinzinger is almost giving them a layup, so that if something can plausibly be blamed on Putin, on the Russians, then we'll intervene directly. And as I point out, as Dave DeCamps did some great work at antiwar.com, there's various biological research facilities that have been funded by the Pentagon that could be hit. Because, I mean, we also know that apparently some of them may contain old Soviet-era bioweapons.
And Patrick McFarland, the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Institute.
What up, Pat?
Patrick, when it comes to the Supreme Court draft that has come about, could you give us, as a lawyer, some idea as to how we can look at this thing? Is it as big as they're saying? Is it a nothing burger? What's going on?
Well, I think it's huge because it marks the first time in the Supreme Court's history where there has been a leak of a pre-published opinion, and it's a huge thing for the integrity of the Supreme Court itself. And I know that sounds kind of like I don't know, a blue pill narrative that you're getting from the press, but it really is. And of course, for some people, that might be kind of a good thing in terms of maybe it's not best to have 9 lawyers make huge sweeping decisions for issues of social policy for the country, or many other issues for that matter. And Jeff Deist is someone that I really appreciate, who talks about this all the time, is, maybe there shouldn't be one uniform policy for the entirety of the United States. We're 330 million very different people with different cultures. And so to have 50 states just yoked under kind of the window of the 14th Amendment is primarily how the Supreme Court yokes us all together under these sweeping policy decisions. So maybe it's not quite a bad thing for states' rights, or for the issue of people who would support secession, that the Supreme Court is really floundering right now and not being seen as legitimate, perhaps, by a large portion of the country. So it's a very interesting development. I don't know exactly what that portends for civil issues or the culture war in this country. I think it definitely escalates it, but I believe now is the time for libertarians to be standing up and saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have the entire country being all packaged together under these rules and living under the authority of Washington, D.C. 9 lawyers who come from Harvard and Yale. I believe that Amy Coney Barrett was one of the first Supreme Court justices in quite some time that didn't come from either Harvard or Yale. So it's interesting to see what will happen. Of course, at this point in time, I would underscore the seriousness of the situation in Ukraine and say that the prospect of nuclear war is a little more pressing than the prospect of even further breakdown in cultural relations in the United States. But it certainly is important, and I think it warrants some discussion.
My first item this week is a reprint we did of the great work of Dr. Brian Kaplan, economist at George Mason University. He's talking about a resort that he went to in Mexico. Now, by any reasonable progressive metric, this was a situation where there were big, rich Western exploiters benefiting off the back of cheap Mexican labor. So he says, let's bring a thought experiment into this and try to really understand what's going on here. He says, now suppose Mexican law prohibited such resorts and you wanted to end the ban. Just imagine how easily the defenders of the status quo could demagogue. These resorts allow rich foreigners to exploit poor Mexicans. They are an affront to decency, to dignity. Why should rich foreigners gorge themselves while innocent Mexican children go to bed hungry? Mexicans deserve good jobs, not this basura. The result of this demagoguery, naturally, would be to prevent Mexicans from bettering their condition. Bettering, what a great concept. It captures the idea of improvement without falsely promising that the end result will be good in absolute terms. The key economic point. Banning resorts saves no Mexican children from hunger. Banning resorts would rather cause Mexican children to be hungry by depriving their parents of the best jobs they can get. The reason why Mexicans toil in all inclusive resorts, despite all the obvious drawbacks, is that their other prospects are worse, often much worse. Just talk to the guy desperately peddling straw hats on the beach. Now, the point of all this is when you start with the assumption that regulation's totally legitimate, what you're immediately doing is conceding the high ground to whatever can win the argument at the end of the day. He goes on to say, you know what, instead of having some discussion about what you think is best for billions of complete strangers who you've never met, it's hard to even know what's best for yourself. If we look at the concept of voluntary revealed choice preference, we don't have to get so bogged down in all of these discussions and have to have a national debate every time so-called exploitation exists. So I love that about Kaplan's work. It's a very short article, a few paragraphs, and he really nails down why it's important for us to concede the moral high ground in all of these things, whether it's the Supreme Court, secession, Ukraine, tons of places where we could take this lesson and apply it consistently. Connor Freeman, what is the next item you have for us?
Oh, we can talk about, I really like this piece from Ted Snyder about what's going on with Iran talks right now. So basically, it looked to me like in the middle of December that the Iranians had, or I'd say late December, that the Iranians had gained the upper hand in the talks and that they had negotiated the deal. They were beginning to renegotiate the JCPOA on their terms, namely that they would get the full sanctions relief that they were promised in the deal, but which they were never really granted because the Obama administration was extremely underhanded and even sanctioned them the day the deal was signed. And they also went around telling like foreign businesses and countries not to engage with Iran. So, but now, you know, in the meantime, it looked like the deal was going to be, it was going to succeed. But then in March, things started to change. So at first, there were sort of these protests from the Russians that they were concerned that a lot of their obligations under the deal would not be able to do business with the Iranians if they were subject to sanctions. So they wanted to make sure that did not conflict with their obligations under the deal, taking uranium fuel and things like this. So at first, a lot of people were like, this is going to be the end of the deal. We're not going to return to it. But ultimately, that was squashed relatively easily. And but after that, there was this whole issue of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard being removed from the Foreign Terrorist Organization blacklist, which is this U.S. government list. There's no state actors on that list except for the IRGC. And it basically sanctions, they're already under other global terrorist designation sanctions, but this one is particularly insulting to the Iranians. And they've, like I said, because it treats them like it's not a state, it's not even a legitimate, military force. They're just terrorists. And also it ruins people's lives, actually, because, the IRGC engages in conscription. And there's been all kinds of stories coming out since this became a major scandal about how families get split up. And you're talking about like a doctor who's married to a doctor who can't live with his wife and his kids because he can't get into the United States. And there's lots of other examples of people who just are totally normal in all walks of life who are just prohibited from, even being with their families as a result of these sanctions. Now, at this point, there's been a massive push that we've been following on conflicts of interest for a while now. But in the last, I want to say maybe a month ago, maybe 3 weeks, there was a huge push from Republicans. Elaine Lorio I mentioned earlier from the Democratic side. There were congressional Democrats, Republican senators like Tom Cotton. All these people launched these massive campaigns against returning to the deal. Even this guy, J.D. Vance, who people seem to like. I was just reading a piece from Daniel Larison on his blog earlier today, who he basically says, like, he thought Trump's policy was incredible, his foreign policy. And he goes, I think it really benefited the Middle East, actually. He's like, well, it certainly benefited the state of Israel, he said non-ironically. So the one thing the guy said about Biden, which was so ridiculous, is he goes, Biden's obsession with returning to the Iran deal is he basically said it's a terrible Obama deal, and he's basically an Iran hawk. But what's funny is, the idea that anybody could say that Biden is obsessed with returning to the Iran deal. They've been dragging their feet, increasing sanctions, threatening to just cut off talks at any moment. Blinken is now going around when Ted Snyder gets into this about how, the Israelis have been behind the scenes talking a lot more to the Biden administration all of a sudden again about Iran. So, for instance, when a couple of weeks ago, when Blinken and Milley were all of a sudden coming out, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of State were coming out and going, yeah, the IRGC are a horrible terrorist organization, and we're never going to lift that designation. Also, Blinken was saying on TV, I don't think the deal's ever going to happen again. And so later on, I'm looking through like Jerusalem Post and some of this Israeli media, and you find out that actually the top foreign policy advisor to Naftali Bennett just paid a visit to Washington and was meeting with all these officials. And now actually the national security advisor recently had a meeting with Jake Sullivan, El Hulata, his counterpart. They run they call it the working group with the U.S. and Israel, and they all kinds of things. Like when Biden bombed Syria, they were alerted about it before through the working group. And the thing that is mentioned here in this article by Ted Snyder is that we're seeing in the Israeli press now, they're saying that they're speaking with Biden officials. You have officials quoting other officials, not always named, but saying that the more we talk to the Americans, the more it appears that they're ready to just leave the deal, that the deal is dead. And they're very comfortable talking about how the deal is finished, and it's completely dwindling any chance of returning to compliance for either side. And in the meantime, we have Blinken running around saying that the Iranians are trying to assassinate Mike Pompeo. And also Brian Hook, who was the Iran envoy under Pompeo during the maximum pressure campaign and all of this. And now they have promised revenge for the Soleimani assassination, which is understandable. He's one of the most revered and powerful figures in they're the top military commander of their top military, most elite military force, the Quds force of the IRGC. And this guy was essentially the mastermind of the anti-ISIS war, and is viewed as, in many ways, as kind of the leader of the axis of resistance, which means a lot to people resisting American imperialism and Zionist aggression and Saudi aggression in the region. And so it's understandable that they have vowed revenge. Now, is there any evidence that the Iranians are carrying out some sort of an assassination campaign on American soil? Absolutely not. Does Blinken present any of this evidence when he says this stuff to Congress? No. And the claim is that not the claim, but what's so outrageous. I know it sounds like peanuts compared to everything else the government spends money on, but the idea, there's something that makes me sick just knowing that every month the American people are being taxed $2 million to provide this 24-hour security detail to Mike Pompeo because of a made-up threat from Iran that they're trying to assassinate him. But there's also worse things going on, too, because Jen Psaki responded to a question about whether or not the Biden administration is concerned about Iran getting a nuclear bomb soon. And I think the way they phrased it was within weeks. And she said, yes, it definitely worries us. And then they eventually walked this back, I think a day or two, the next day. And they said, well, we're talking about breakout time, and it's not exactly, it's we didn't mean like they're going to have a bomb in a couple of weeks. But of course, Iran is not seeking nukes. They've never been shown to do that, to be doing so. One of the worst propaganda tactics here is when they say that within weeks stuff, they've never attempted to enrich uranium to 90% or above 90%. The most they have right now is 60% of uranium hexafluoride enriched to 60%, which they did as a negotiating tactic because the Israelis bombed their Natanz centrifuge building site, and which is their main. It's critical to their whole civilian nuclear program. And the other reason why they increased to 20% originally after November was because the Israelis had killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a scientist in Iran. And again, like the assassinate, it's always shoe on the other foot stuff. They're always projecting. So Israel has this, a huge secret nuclear weapons program, which actually, because of foreign assistance laws, amendments made by Stuart Symington and John Glenn back in the 70s, our aid to Israel is actually illegal. You can't give aid to a country that has a secret nuclear weapons program and is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But nevertheless, the Americans have a deal with Israeli leaders that they have basically, it's like a nod and a wink, and we won't say anything if you don't. But the idea that they could just have a bomb in weeks, the Iranians anyway, even if they wanted to, it's just not true. It takes months and possibly years to build a nuclear weapon, and there's all kinds of things. You have to build a delivery vehicle. They'd have to enrich uranium to a level they've never done before. They'd have to create, first of all, they'd have to create a test bomb, and they'd have to test it. And at that point, they would have used up all the uranium that they had for the bomb, and they'd have to start over from scratch. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, if they ever actually did go for a bomb, even though it might conceivably help avoid a war, there would be enough time that the Americans and the Israelis and their allies would already attack Iran. And the truth is, what's really dangerous here is if they keep the sanctions on, they maintain the maximum pressure campaign, like I assume Biden will at this point. I was optimistic for a few months, like I mentioned before, but at this point, I'm not 100%. I'm really leaning towards they're going to just destroy it and just stick with the Trump policy, because I think they're very concerned about how the Republicans and the hawkish Democrats like Bob Menendez, for instance, are going to respond, and what it'll mean for them politically come November. So it's just very unfortunate. And the real concern, too, as Trita Parsi has talked about a couple of times, including on the Scott Horton show, is that some of the worst hawks here might be trying to goad Iran out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they already have a fully safeguarded nuclear and above board civilian program that's safeguarded by the IAEA. So they've been known to not have nuclear weapons for decades and decades. The JCPOA is just the most comprehensive nuclear inspections regime ever implemented. So it's like a double, triple confirmation that Iran does not have nukes, and they're not seeking nukes, and they're not even trying to make nukes. So, and they until Trump left the deal, they waited a year before they started expanding, enrichment and uranium enrichment, and building the more advanced centrifuges and doing things that were outside the parameters of the written agreement. But again, I mean, just like with that 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride I mentioned earlier, all of that was for purposes of negotiation, which is one of the reasons why I think they were able to secure a better deal, because they put forward basically a proposal where they would, like I said, get full sanctions relief. And there were even things in there like where I believe Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator in Vienna for the Iranian side, they basically all they had to do was disconnect their advanced centrifuges. They didn't have to dismantle them. So one of the reasons why I think that's so important is because they were able to get the Biden administration back to the table after the maximum pressure campaign. I think ultimately they made a big concession because the Trump administration was trying to keep the sanctions on them, and basically the Iranians originally said, we won't talk to you until you lift the sanctions. The Biden administration never did, but the Iranians still went to the table hoping to extract many of the same concessions that the Trump campaign was trying to get out of the Iranians, which were, non-starters, things that would never happen, like give up your ballistic missiles and stop, and your alliance with Hezbollah and Assad and all this. But long story short, that's an insurance policy. This whole we don't have to dismantle the advanced centrifuges. So if, say, Biden returns to the deal, and then as he wasn't able to promise this wouldn't happen, infamously, there was a piece Treated Parsi wrote about, I want to say maybe in August of last year, about an incident in May where they made it clear to the Iranians that, yeah, if we return to the deal, we can't promise that we'll keep the sanctions off and we won't back out of it before the end of my administration. Even if, there wasn't even, if I remember correctly, the idea was like, even if you're not shown to be outside of, even if you remain in full compliance, we still may launch sanctions. And so it's just a very unfortunate situation. But I think that if they can get that deal, that's a good insurance policy, because they can get them back to the negotiating table. The Americans, that is, much faster, as they have historically. I mean, the American narrative is that our sanctions is what gets the Iranians to the table and for us to talk. But really, it's them ramping up their nuclear program, which is peaceful, but just doing things like I mentioned before, enriching uranium to a higher level, building more of these advanced centrifuges, et cetera. It's enough of a sort of a latent, it's not a threat. It's a deterrent, I suppose. And it means that they can't just push the Iranians around. They're going to have to eventually talk to them, because, it's enough pressure they can apply peacefully in order to get to the Americans to want to negotiate.
Patrick, what do you got for us here? Former NATO commander disguises war propaganda as novel.
Yeah, I was really excited with how this article turned out, and I was really glad to see that it was picked up by Zero Hedge, and it ran as the spotlight on antiwar.com last week. This is a book that I read a few months ago, but it was really striking to me because it is a fiction novel written by the former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis. And in this book, him and his co-author Elliot Ackerman discuss what the next world war might look like. And the title of the novel is 2034. And I think that what made it really interesting is that it provided a view into what the psychology is of NATO and some of the NATO members and the leadership of NATO, and of course the foreign policy, quote unquote, experts and establishment behind NATO itself. So what it really does is it talks about, how there's going to be an engagement in the South China Sea between U.S. vessels on freedom of navigation patrols, that Iran would use that opportunity to capture and hold hostage a U.S. pilot, that the United States would, in response to a limited engagement between the U.S. and Chinese vessel, they would launch a full-scale naval assault against China, and they would be soundly defeated because of a Chinese advances in cyber weapons and capabilities. That in the novel, China basically turns off all of the U.S. communications and navigations abilities with the cyber attack. And then, of course, Russia chooses to invade Poland at that time. And then the novel concludes with a limited nuclear exchange between the United States and China. So really apocalyptic kind of eyebrow-raising stuff here that's being foreseen by the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And I think it bears paying attention to kind of get a window into what that psychology is. And to some of us, that might be unsurprising. If you pay attention, these are all things that the foreign policy establishment has been warning about and foreseeing. But I think the one trick that gets people who maybe don't really pay attention to foreign policy is that when this novel was published, all of the establishment outfits tried to sell it as some kind of cautionary tale, some kind of warning. Oh, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO is going to come forward and say, oh, well, we better pay attention, because if we don't pay attention, we're going to get into World War III with China. Well, his solution to that is that, well, the United States has to get more unified, and we have to step up our engagement against China in terms of, doing more freedom of navigation patrols and putting more U.S. embassies in the Indo-Pacific, what it's called now. So I went through and I took a peek at what Wired magazine had to say and what the Washington Post had to say when this book was published. And again, they try to sell it as if, oh, well, we want to avoid World War III at all costs. But then if you get into what Stavridis and Ackerman actually say in their interviews, well, the policy that they put forward is, how important the South China Sea is to the United States, and how we need to be, protecting the Senkaku Islands, and we need to be supporting our allies and forming, doing more combined military drills with them in the South China Sea, and do all of these things, and try to demonstrate to China that we, deter them by being strong and to pledging to defend these areas that the United States the average person in the United States has no real interest in whether or not shipping lanes are open in the South China Sea. And to the extent that they do because of consumer prices or anything like that, well, I think it's unrealistic to think that China would seize these areas and then just prevent people from trading goods with them in these areas, just because of the financial interest that they have themselves. So I conclude just basically by saying that, well, despite resolutely warning against a war with China, Stavridis commits the U.S. to myriad tripwires that would ignite it. And I kind of tie it in with Stavridis' his positions on Ukraine, which is always more, and more funding and training Ukrainians, more U.S. commitment to NATO, more U.S. weaponization of big tech, more money to the U.S. State Department, and more interagency cooperation, and more silencing dissent of journalists and people who have other points of view. So this is incredibly dangerous, and I think that people should wise up to the fact that, if the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO publishes a fiction novel that purports to warn against World War III, but then instead advocates policies that would cause World War III, that's something that I think we got to speak out against.
My second item here is from The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. This is a great book that I've been reading. It's very in-depth, but there are some really great takeaways on page 22, titled Saving Time. Time, that is the key. Forget dollars, shells, or gold. The true measure of something's worth is the hours it takes to acquire it. That's what prosperity is. The increase in the amount of goods or services you can earn with the same amount of work. He talks about the cost over time of how much it would cost to take a journey from Paris to Nice, or how much work you'd have to do to access a gallon of milk or to get a refrigerator. Then he talks about the increase in quality of things like phones and refrigerators. Such a much more effective mechanism of measuring wealth than GDP, something very lazy that they always go with. I was also surprised he goes on to admit that the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, Rockefellers, the Jeff Bezoses, the Henry Fords, the Charles Martin Halls of the world got wealthy as a result of increasing access to products and services to people at lower income levels. So this is totally obliterating the myth that, well, if the state doesn't monopolize security protection, then obviously only the 1% are going to have security, whereas the problem is, in the first place, that the state monopolizes the security. I really like his King Louis example. He says, consider this. The cornucopia that greets you as you enter the supermarket dwarfs anything that Louis XIV ever experienced, and is probably less likely to contain salmonella. You can buy a fresh, frozen, tinned, smoked, or pre-prepared meal made with beef, chicken, pork, lamb, fish, prawns, scallops, eggs, potatoes, beans, carrots, cabbage, kumquats, celery, okra, 7 kinds of lettuce, cooked in olive, walnut, sunflower, or peanut oil and flavored with cilantro, basil, or rosemary. You have no chefs, but you can decide on a whim to choose between scores of nearby bistros or Italian or Chinese or Japanese or Indian restaurants, in each of which a team of skilled chefs is waiting to serve your family at less than an hour's notice. Think of this. Never before this generation has the average person been able to have somebody else prepare their meals. He then talks about the ability to access far distances through things like airplanes, courtesy of the Wright brothers and free market exchanges. So that is the main thing that I was focused on. Gentlemen, any other quick items? Connor, do you have one more quick one for us? We got about 5 minutes left here.
Yeah, sure. We'll go to that Consortium news piece by Joe Loria. Let's see. So
you know what? That was the one that was just having trouble loading. So
oh yeah,
try and open.
No, it's cool. If that doesn't work, I'd love to hear Pat talk about his new piece on Adam Kinzinger.
Yes, Pat. Let's do that. Just because Consortium news, I even tried opening it up in a different tab, not getting anything there. Pat, anything else on Kinzinger?
Yeah. So I saw that yesterday that Connor had published his piece, his newest piece on the Institute page, and it had a picture of Adam Kinzinger on it, Kinzinger on it, and my heart froze because I thought maybe he had covered the same thing that I did in my article. But this hasn't been published yet on the Institute. I have a free, it's up for my supporting subscribers on Substack here. But essentially what I did is I was digging into Adam Kinzinger's past, and when I looked into his past, I saw that he has been instrumental in the House introducing legislation that has brought us on a path of confrontation with Russia over Ukraine. He most recently on May 1st proposed the authorization of use of military force, but he has been there all along. So he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2010. In March 2014, he pledged that the House would back the Obama administration's efforts in Ukraine. And then he stated that the House would consider legislation calling for increased aid to Ukraine, up to and including adding Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And of course, at the time that he pledged this, March 2014, this was soon after the conclusion of the 2014 Euromaidan coup, in which the U.S. State Department played a role, or at the very least took advantage of the situation when Viktor Yanukovych was ousted. And then, of course, we know the Ukraine civil war started the next month after Kinzinger made that pledge in March 2014. Then in 2016, Kinzinger co-authored H.R. 5094, which was called the Stability and Democracy for Ukraine Act, otherwise known as the Stand for Ukraine Act. And that act unanimously passed the U.S. House by voice vote, and it was engineered to contain, reverse, and deter Russian aggression in Ukraine, to support the sovereignty of Crimea against Russia's quote-unquote illegal annexation, and to ultimately assist Ukraine's democratic transition. Well, what that did, in effect, was make it impossible to remove certain anti-Russian sanctions unless Crimea was returned to Ukraine. And at the time, when it was passed in 2016, Jason Ditz from antiwar.com basically came out and said that. So since the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened, Kinzinger has been out there beating the war drums, asking for more U.S. assistance to Ukraine. And he was one of the congressmen who was most pushing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And funnily enough, his website said, "Oh well, Kinzinger is a hero because he flew a plane during Iraq and Afghanistan, so therefore he's qualified to say that we definitely need a no-fly zone over Ukraine." And that's what his website offered, is for the simpletons out there, the NPCs out there, to glob on to that sentiment. And the more I looked into Kinzinger's past, I saw some connections to neoconservatism that should be familiar. Kinzinger himself is a rhino, a Republican in name only, But if you look through his past, you'll see that he's rubbed elbows very often with none other than Fred Kagan and Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. And so if you go through and I talk about how he's given speeches at the American Enterprise Institute, he's given intimate discussions at the Foreign Policy Initiative, which was started by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. They're both famous for starting the Weekly Standard and being members of the Project for a New American Century. Kinzinger has also spoken for the Hudson Institute, which is a neoconservative think tank whose founder, Herman Kahn, was famous for his efforts to develop a quote-unquote winnable nuclear war strategy. And Kinzinger has also spoken at the Atlantic Council and some other think tanks too. And I just think that, we cannot escape these neoconservatives. And if you go back, I had Robbie Martin from Media Roots Radio on to talk about his documentary, which, Connor, will you help me out? What's
A Very Heavy Agenda.
Yeah, a Very Heavy Agenda. Sorry, I just had a mind blank there. So in that, he really traces the influence that this group, the Foreign Policy Initiative, has had on U.S.-Ukraine policy, and how dangerous it is and what their agenda seems to be. And of course, I had to make the connection that Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was the Assistant Secretary of State during the 2014 Euromaidan coup. And so we have a connection between, Bill Kristol, a neoconservative think tank, and his wife, Victoria Nuland, who is very involved, or was at least very instrumental in creating the situation that led to essentially we find ourselves in with the United States and the Ukraine. So I'm really excited to put this piece out, and I'm excited for people to read it and let me know what they think about it.
That is all the time we have this week. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. Connor and Patrick, thank you for your time, fellas.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.